is Michael. I'm on the worship team here. I play bass on Sundays sometimes. My wife is Julie. She works in the kids area. We were involved in attending Bridgepoint for probably about a year or so before we really started tithing, before we started giving. Our approach was almost that our time was enough, that we were giving our time and that was our contribution. We were very much kind of consumers of Bridgepoint. What can we get out of Bridgepoint? We felt like we were giving back enough. But after about a year or so of attending, Pastor Matt called a meeting and informed everyone that the budget was not where it needed to be, and that everyone needed to kind of do their part to help keep the finances where we like to keep them, and to be able to operate without debt. And we did not realize until that point, or it didn't occur to us until that point that we needed to be giving financially as well as everybody else. Bridgepoint was no longer a church that we were expecting to provide for us, but it had become a church that we wanted to be a part of and wanted to also contribute financially as well. When we first started, she would, if we had extra money in our accounts, she would throw some in, or I would throw some in, if it was there, but it was not something that we prioritized. So, it was basically hey, after that meeting, it was hey, we need to do this. How much should we do? We set an amount, and then we've continued with that kind of percentage. As our income increased, we increased the giving and everything like that. But it was very much a obligation at that point. It was, we know we're supposed to do this, so we're doing it. Not that we wanted to. We weren't giving joyfully or anything like that. It was just, hey, this is what we were told we need to be doing in order to, be doing our part. So going from the giving being an obligation to something that we want to do really was something that was, it wasn't quick for us. It wasn't something that one day, our outlook changed on it. It was, we continued to do it, and it became habit just because we had set up, the automatic draft. So it was something we didn't even think about. It was just, it happened. I think it was Pastor Matt mentioned a while ago, when you start going to the gym, when you first go, it's a decision you have to make every day, and then all of a sudden it becomes a habit. It becomes something that you want to do, that you feel like you're missing out if you don't do it. The reward for that habit has been seeing what Bridgepoint has been able to do for other families that they come in, not just like when we first started going to Bridgepoint and we were looking, what can Bridgepoint do for us? Now we're able to give our time and our money and provide that same kind of service to the new families that are coming in, and that we're in our situation where we were those years ago, where we didn't have a home church and we didn't really know what it meant to be part of a church family.
Well, good morning. And I want to start off by just wishing all of the dads here a very happy Father's Day. I think that we know none of us would be who we are today if it wasn't for the influence of our dads. And I say this every year, but I just think it's so funny, on Mother's Day, churches, we honor our moms, and rightly so. And then on Father's Day, the sermon's always like, dads, you suck. You need to be a better man. You get your family to church. And let me just tell you, that's not what we're going to do today. We just want to honor all of the dads here, because I'm so thankful we live in a generation where we don't have dads who come home and kind of detach. I'm sure that may happen in some houses, but what I've noticed is we live in a current culture and generation where we have a lot of dads that are involved in raising kids and raising a family together, and we want to honor that. And the other kind of father is not just a biological father, but spiritual fathers. Dude, when we follow Jesus, we're born into a new spiritual family. And there are even spiritual fathers in my own life who have spoken in and helped me grow and shape me into the man that God wants me to become. And so whether or not you have biological children, for all the spiritual fathers out there, we want to honor you as well. So Bridgepoint family, could we just give it up for all our dads here this morning? Now, today is also Juneteenth, which maybe for some of us might be a newer holiday that we're learning about, and you might be wondering, well, why on earth are you talking about this, Matt? Well, let me talk a little bit about what Juneteenth is. If you remember from history class, on January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and we know racism and slavery ended instantly, right? No, that's not at all what happened. In fact, he gives the proclamation, but there were still, the Confederate States still owned slaves. And in fact, the Union soldiers, even after the Confederacy fell, would have to go into these states to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, during this time, a lot of slave owners actually moved to Texas because it was the most remote part of the Confederate States. And so for the next couple of years, the actual amount of slaves in Texas grew by the thousands. But then it was on June 19th, 1865, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, that Union soldiers landed in Galveston and went through the streets of Texas and actually enforced the Emancipation Proclamation and freeing slaves. So we celebrate this day as a day where we remember that our nation kind of repented from slavery and gave freedom to those who were previously enslaved. And I think as Christians, it is so important for us to remember and observe for a couple reasons. The first one is this: I think today for us as Christians, it's a day to lament maybe some of the things in our nation's past that did not honor God and his ways. And while we sitting in this room, maybe we're not a direct part of that, I think we can lament and recognize, hey, there are ways where the enemy was at work and things were not in our nation as they are in heaven. But then also, one thing, for whether it was from the abolitionist movement to the civil rights movement, people who were leaders in that were oftentimes moved by their deep faith in Jesus. From William Wilberforce all the way to Martin Luther King Jr., it is people's faith that sees people not as objects to be manipulated, but as people made in the image of God, that moves us to help people find freedom and equality. And so today is also a day, I believe, for Christians, not to make it a political thing, but we're making it a heaven thing. Right? Like, we want to bring heaven to earth, and so we need to continue to be leaders in that. We've come a long way, and we still have a long way to go. And so this morning, before we just jump into our series, I'd love to take just a moment of silence and prayer and just remind ourselves who we've been called to be. So would you just bow your heads and close your eyes with me? Jesus, we come before you this morning. We're so thankful for the fathers that you brought into our lives, our biological fathers, spiritual fathers. Thankful for the ways that you've used them to shape us into the people we are today. And at the same time, God, I just want to take a moment here and just lament, even in our own nation, ways that we have not honored you and honored other people. We lament a history of slavery and even the things that we enjoy today because of that. But as you're shaping and molding us more into your image, God, today would you give us new vision and strength and courage to continue to bring heaven to earth, to continue to fight for freedom and equality for people who are made in your image. God, in all things, would you help us to become more like you? It's in your name I pray. Amen. You know, I feel like every prayer I end is kind of the same, like to help us become more like you. That's like really intentional, because I think for a lot of us who are in this room today, maybe there's some of you who are kind of exploring faith and checking it out. And if that's you, we're so glad you're here. Like, this is a safe space for you to do that. I think for a lot of us, you're here today, like, listen, you could be doing a number of things, especially on Father's Day, right? You could be still sleeping. You could be hanging out at the pool. You could be eating Mexican food. There's a number of things that you could be doing, but you're here. And I think that's because you want to follow Jesus and you want to become more like him. And one way that God helps us do that is through generosity. That's what this series has been about. And I actually think my favorite part of this series has been all the stories that you guys have heard from people right here in our church family. I think that the best sermon is not a sermon that's preached, but a sermon that's lived. I'll tell you what, like what Michael shared today is going to be better than anything you're going to hear from me this morning. And so we'll just set the expectation low right off the bat there. But I loved his honesty too, in that when he was giving, like at first it's an obligation. But as he continues to do that, it's shaped and molded him and his family into a generous family. The things that we do something to us. And that's what generosity is all about. It's about how God helps us grow into these spiritual parents, these spiritual fathers and mothers that he's called us to be. And we've talked about how, children and infants, super selfish, right? They're going to write all the dads sweet cards today, but then later they're going to ask you to do 28,000 more things for them. And that's okay because children are selfish. That's where they're supposed to be. But we hope that as they grow up, they focus less on themselves and more on other people. And in the same way, when we grow spiritually, yes, spiritual children, they'll follow Jesus as long as it's convenient and as long as he doesn't ask too much and as long as it fits into my schedule. But as we grow and develop from spiritual infancy to childhood to adulthood and to parenthood, our focus shifts away from us and on to others. And see, that's why God calls us to be a generous people. It's not because God needs your money, right? He owns the whole world, okay? We said it the first week. Generosity is not God's fundraising plan. It's his family raising plan. It's how he helps you and I become more like him. Now, I have a question for you this morning. What is the difference? And this is not a trick question at all. This is not a joke, not a trick question. Last service I asked and people just stared at me, okay? I'm never going to ask you a trick question from the stage, okay? What does it take from someone to go from being an adult to being a parent? What does that take? Yeah, you got to have a kid, right? There we go. You guys much more on the ball here in the second service. Told you, easy questions, all right? You have to have a kid. So if the goal is that God wants to grow us to be spiritual parents, at some point we have to have spiritual children, which means at some point we are going to have to help somebody kind of cross the threshold from not believing in Jesus to now they're following him. Now, the theological term for this is a word called evangelism. And anybody ever heard the word evangelism before? Anybody here ever kind of like not sure how you feel about evangelism, right? Like, I'll be honest with you as a pastor, I grew up in the 90s and 2000s Christian subculture, right? So you got like DC Talk and you got Veggie Tales and Carmen even. You remember Carmen? He had to battle the demon. Anybody remember that? Just all right, cool. Okay, a few of us. Now, I thought I was steeped in the culture until I married my wife, and she knew things I'd never heard about, like Salty the Singing Songbook, right? You have Adventures in Odyssey and Bible Man, the whole thing. Between the two of us, we know everything about 90s and early 2000 Christian subculture. But in that time period, one thing that was often really pushed, and they did this, they had whole conferences even for teenagers to do this, was that the best way to evangelize was to go up to random people and either ask them the question, do you know where you would go today if you died tonight, like where you would end up, or to give you a little pamphlet, a little tract to walk people through. Now, listen, I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with that, but to me, that always had made me feel a little uncomfortable, if I'm being honest. It's like I got to feel like I got to be a salesman for Jesus, right? Like, let me just push a little Jesus on you here. And then, by the way, we turn around later and complain that people treat Jesus as a get-out-of-hell-free card. But isn't that kind of what we pushed on people to get them to pray the prayer to begin with? That's a different sermon for a different time. But I think we have this like weird relationship with evangelism. And I'll be honest with you guys, I'm an introvert. Like, I love what I do, and I love being around people, but when I want to recharge, I just want to be away from people. I don't want to talk. Like, you know what I want to do for Father's Day? I want to be left alone. That's all I really want, like read a book by the pool, just recharge. But then all of a sudden you start to feel guilty because if you didn't sit on a plane next to a stranger and lead them to faith in Jesus, then, man, you're like the worst Christian ever. And so I always felt like this weirdness with evangelism. But then I started reading scripture. You know, the word evangelism doesn't appear in the Bible. And certainly not the way that we have conceived of it. Now, are we supposed to share our faith with people? Absolutely. But I wonder if God's plan for how we do that looks different from what we've been told and looks a little bit more like something where we're walking with people all throughout their life. Jesus didn't go and make converts. He said, go and make disciples. Right? Like, it's easy to go make a convert. Like, you can go knock on people's doors and get them to pray a prayer, and we made a convert. But that's not making a disciple. And what Jesus is asking is like, hey, as you take someone who now begins their spiritual life, now you haven't just committed to like a little conversation on a doorstep, but now you got to walk with them the rest of their life as they follow Jesus, which sounds a little bit scarier. But to me, that sounds a little bit more manageable, because I think the way that Jesus expects evangelism to work is actually through one aspect of generosity called hospitality. That's what we're going to talk about today, generosity through hospitality. I think this is actually how we are going to help people begin a relationship with Jesus. This is something that has been core to what it means to follow Jesus from the very beginning. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2, it says, don't neglect to show hospitality, for by doing this, some have welcomed angels as guests without knowing it. Now, I chose this verse because there's one in 1 Peter that I felt personally attacked. It says, practice hospitality without grumbling or complaining, right? Like, oh, I'll be hospitable, but I'm not going to like it. You know, that can be my attitude sometimes. But all throughout the scripture, we're told, be hospitable, practice hospitality. All right, now, what words come to your mind when you hear hospitality? Just shout them out. Oh, you guys were on the ball with the last question. Come on, hospitality, what do you think of? Food, that's always a good one. What else? What? Welcome. All right, good. At last service, someone said grandma. I was like, hey, I'm down with that one too. You know, when I think of hospitality, I think of like a hospitality suite or tent at an event, and you go in, there's like snacks and drinks, kind of rest for a little bit. Think about the buffet. I'm down with that one too. That's my love language right there. A good all-you-can-eat buffet. I think sometimes of the hospitality industry, with like Airbnbs and hotels. I even think hospitality is like inviting people over to my house that I love and I relate to. And all of those are great things. By the way, I'm down for the buffet, trust me. But that's actually not what the Bible means when it talks about hospitality. The word that gets translated into our word hospitality, it's a Greek word that literally means love the stranger. Because when I think of hospitality, I think I want to have my friends over for dinner. I want to go out to eat with my family. I want to do those things. But when the Bible talks about hospitality, it means love the stranger. Now, we don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews, but we know that they're steeped in Jewish culture, and they're likely writing to Jewish Christians. And for Jewish people, remember, stranger would have meant anyone who was not Jewish. So they're different race, different ethnicity, different faith, different background, different ways of seeing the world. And what it means to follow Jesus is that we love and welcome the stranger. Now, that can seem like a daunting task, but I'm glad that Jesus never asked us to do anything that he himself didn't do. And Jesus was a master at practicing hospitality, which is crazy to think about. I've said this before, but I just can't get over this fact, like especially in our culture, like Jesus was homeless. In fact, scholars think that at least for a portion of his ministry, Jesus lived in Peter's mom's house. Like his disciple Peter, he lived in Peter's mom's house. So I know we kind of like joke about the 30-year-old living in their mom's basement, but that was kind of Jesus for a little bit. He didn't have a house, he didn't have stuff, and yet he practiced hospitality on a consistent basis. What does that look like? There's a number of stories that we could look at, but this morning I want to look at one from Luke chapter 19. If you have your Bible, go ahead and open there. And I want to read this whole story. It's going to be Bible story time with Matt this morning. We're going to read this whole story. And as we do, you're going to be familiar with it. You know this story, but I want us to pay attention to the details. Notice maybe what would you expect to happen, what actually happened, and let's see this with fresh insight. Let's go ahead and jump in this morning. Luke chapter 19, verse 1 says, he, that means Jesus, entered Jericho and was passing through. And there was a man named Zacchaeus, who was a wee little man and a chief tax collector, and he was rich. By the way, When the Bible points out that somebody's rich, that's never like a virtue. Right? It's usually they're struggling with this. He's a chief tax collector, and he's rich. And he was trying to see who Jesus was, but he was not able because of the crowd, since he was a short man. So running ahead, he climbed up a sycamore tree to see Jesus, since he was about to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, because today it is necessary for me to stay at your house. Today I must stay at your house." So he quickly came down and welcomed him joyfully, and all who saw it began to rejoice. No, that's not what it says. It says, all who saw it began to complain. He's gone to stay with a sinful man. But Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, I'll give half of my possessions to the poor, Lord, and if I have extorted anything from anyone, I'll pay back 4 times as much." Today, salvation has come to this house, Jesus told him, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost. I'd love for us to read that last phrase there, starting with "for the Son of Man." All right, let's read that together. 3, 2, 1. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost. And what a powerful story. Now, if we grew up and we heard this in Sunday school, we might be tempted to think that this is, the moral of the story is that Jesus loves short people too. But there's actually so much going on in this story. In fact, the people who were there didn't find this cute. They didn't find this encouraging or inspiring, but they found it offensive. They found that there was something wrong with the way Jesus handled this whole situation. And I think what offended them ought to challenge us. Now, there's a few things you have to understand if we're going to really grasp the significance of what Jesus is doing here. The first one is this: Zacchaeus was a tax collector. Now, in that day, tax collectors were despised because the way that they made their money is they would collect taxes for Rome and then add in all their fees on top. Now, scholars estimate that the tax rate from the Romans at this point was about 50%. But Zacchaeus could go in and say, you know what, it's 70% for you. So you give Rome their 50% and pocket the other 20%. Now, not only that, but as a tax collector, Zacchaeus would have the full force of the Roman military to be able to collect the taxes. And so if you didn't pay, bad things would happen to you. And if you ticked a tax collector off, they could say, well, you know what? The rates just went up. So now today it's 90%. And so you can imagine like Jesus' disciple Peter getting off the boat and he's caught all these fish. And there Zacchaeus says, hey, welcome in. Guess what? Give me 75% of everything that you have. And then we know that Zacchaeus must have been pretty darn good at his job because it said he was rich. He made a lot of money doing this. Now, he was all the more despised because he's a Jewish man. And at this point, the Jewish people are living under Roman occupation. They don't want to be part of the Roman Empire. They want their freedom. And so can you imagine how frustrating it would be to see your own flesh and blood, to see someone who follows the same God as you, and they're actually stealing money from you to pad their pockets and to keep the oppressors in power? Like the Jewish people hated tax collectors. In fact, they were at the bottom of the social order right alongside prostitutes. It was always prostitutes and tax collectors. Which, by the way, I find it funny because who did Jesus often share meals with? Prostitutes and tax collectors. Now, if you're like me, I don't enjoy paying taxes. I mean, maybe some of you do, but we don't love paying taxes. But even the tax collector, the IRS, doesn't have the same kind of vitriol towards it that Zacchaeus would have had. Even sex workers in our day, the prostitutes, we don't look at them kind of with the same anger that the Jewish people would have. And so it's kind of hard to come up with a modern day equivalent of a tax collector, but it would almost be like if this was a story about how Jesus wanted to hang out with a registered sex offender, or if Jesus wanted to hang out with a white nationalist, or if Jesus was going to, set up camp with some ISIS members. Like, I mean, that kind of that gut reaction you have is like, wait a second, Jesus wouldn't do that. That's exactly what the people, Jesus wouldn't hang out with a tax collector. So surely he wouldn't do that. Something would have to be way wrong if he is doing that. Now, the other thing you have to understand is the importance that meals had in this culture. Because even today in Eastern cultures, meals are not like, I'm going to go out to, you guys know where I'm going for lunch today for Father's Day. Yeah, I don't have to say it, but I'm going to go out for lunch later today. We'll have friends will be there. It'll be great. It's my second home at this point, and we're going to go and we're going to have a good time. But in that culture, you would only share a meal with people who had the most intimate relationships with you. In fact, if families got in severe disagreements, they would no longer eat together. And oftentimes the first step towards reconciliation of important relationships was sitting down to eat a meal together. Now, especially for the Jewish people in this time, meals had even more importance placed on them because of their history. I want to give me 2 minutes to give you a little Old Testament history there. In the Old Testament, the nation of Israel was supposed to show the world what heaven on earth looks like. Right? Hopefully we're tracking with that if you've been here at Bridgepoint for a little bit of time. That's why they have all those rules and regulations. The Bible's not a list of rules and regulations. It shows us what heaven on earth is supposed to look like. And this was exemplified through the very existence of the temple, because God's presence dwelt inside the temple. So if there was a Venn diagram where heaven and earth overlap, the little overlap part, that was the temple. That's heaven on earth. Now, Old Testament history, then you know that Israel turned their back on God for centuries, and he had begged and pleaded with them to come back. They wouldn't. He removes his protection. Their enemies come in and conquer them. What is almost the first thing their enemies do when they come in and conquer Israel? Destroy the temple, right? And so the temple is destroyed, which means God's presence has left the earth, but it also means, wait a second, how are we going to offer sacrifices? How are we going to meet with God? How are we going to worship him? And there's this period in between temples where the Jewish people developed this theology where now you don't do that stuff in the temple, but you do that stuff in your home. So the home became seen as this sacred ground. And furthermore, if it's your house where worship is happening, then that makes you, by default, a priest. Now, you get around to the time of Jesus, the Jewish people are still living under Roman occupation. And the Jewish leaders of that day have said, you know what? It was our sin that got us conquered. So if we could just get rid of sin, then God would free us. And so they thought, if we could just for one day keep all of God's commands, if all of us could act like a priest for one day, then God would be forced to rescue us. And I think sometimes we can hear that and be like, oh, how legalistic could you be? But I cannot tell you how many times I've heard people say, if we can just share the gospel with everybody in the world, then Jesus will have to come back for the second coming. So we do the same kind of stuff today. And by the way, it always starts with a great motivation. We want people to hear about Jesus, right? We would love Jesus to come back and bring heaven to earth. They wanted God to rescue their people so heaven could come to earth, but they end up kind of becoming the moral police. Which is why you can see that they didn't like tax collectors and prostitutes. We're trying to get everybody to do the right things, and you guys are living lives where you keep doing the wrong things. And so you could never have a tax collector come into your house, because guess what would happen? Your house is defiled. Your temple is defiled. You have taken on their sinfulness and their uncleanliness. In fact, I ran across work of a few scholars this week, and I don't know if I fully buy this, but I thought this was interesting enough to at least pass along to you. There is one theory that Zacchaeus, the type of tax collector he was a temple tax collector. Because priests in the temple could not touch Roman money because it had a picture of Caesar on it, and that would make them unclean. They couldn't do the work of the temple. And so they would have people stationed at the front of the temple, and when Jewish people came in to pay the temple tax, they would give the Roman money to that tax collector, and he would become unclean, and then he would give them their Jewish money that didn't have any faces on it, so they could pay their temple tax, and that the priests would remain clean and they could do their work. And so the reason that you're like, Matt, what does that have to do with anything? Zacchaeus is a short man. He cannot see Jesus because of the crowds, which again, theme all throughout the Gospels, the crowds always get in the way of people coming to Jesus. Why didn't he just push through? And what they suggest is because he was unclean. And if he touched any of them, he would have made other people unclean. And he had been so ostracized from society. He had been used and abused by the priests who were supposed to love him and instead keep him perpetually unclean. And so he's so cast out that he has to climb up this tree and get a glimpse of Jesus. Now, whether or not that is true, we do know that they definitely viewed him as unclean for one reason or another. And so for Jesus to go up to this man and to say, I must stay at your house. Like, he doesn't say, hey, why don't we go grab Zaxby's together? No, he says, I must. It's almost like that was his whole point of being there, is that he must stay in Zacchaeus' house. And that's when people began to complain. But Jesus, you're going to be unclean. Jesus, people are going to think you endorse that sort of behavior. People are going to think you agree with him. Jesus, you cannot do that. And hopefully you can read the subtext there as we still say the same things about people today. Oh, well, you can't get close to that person because then people might think you agree with their lifestyle. Oh, well, you can't really love them because then what are people going to think? And I find it just, in some ways, it's encouraging that we're still dealing with some issues, and in some ways, it's very depressing. We deal with the same issues. We always like to put ourselves in the place of the hero in the story, but I wonder if the story's there because it's supposed to convict us of the ways we continue to act like the crowds and the Pharisees even today. And notice, this is so beautiful. It says that he welcomed him joyfully. By the way, in the Greek, it's ambiguous as to whether Jesus is welcoming Zacchaeus joyfully or the other way around. But we just see them like they're so overjoyed and overwhelmed. And notice what Zacchaeus says. Immediately, he's like, I'm giving my stuff away. Like, he's been so radically changed. This is why Jesus said he came to what? We said this together a few minutes ago. Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. And how did he do it? Did Zacchaeus come down and Jesus say, let me walk you through the 10 Commandments and see which of these you're guilty of? Did he point out all of the sins in his life? Did he give him 4 steps to peace with God? No, it was encountering Jesus changed everything. And this, I've always loved this. This is free just for being here today. It's Father's Day. We're giving out free stuff all over the place. In Luke chapter 18, there's a rich young ruler, which he's probably a ruler in the temple. So he's a godly man. He's wealthy, right? A lot of the same stuff as Zacchaeus, except he's trying to follow God. And he says, Jesus, how do I inherit eternal life? How do I experience heaven on earth? And Jesus says, keep all the commands. He said, I've done that. And Jesus said, great, sell everything you have and give it to the poor. And that man goes away sad because he had many things. But here's Zacchaeus. He encounters Jesus, and without Jesus telling him a word, he's been so radically changed, he wants to give things away. I think a lot of times we're looking for a list of, hey, let me do all this stuff here, and then God's happy with me. But if you have a real encounter with Jesus, everything changes in a moment. And that's what changed for Zacchaeus that day. And I wonder if Jesus says he came to seek and to save the lost. And it's funny, if you look at like Luke chapter 9 through 20, the way he organizes it, Jesus is either eating a meal, leaving a meal, or headed to a meal. Amen? Like that's my Jesus. I love that. But it's almost as if Jesus is saying he came to seek and to save the lost, and he's going to do it one meal at a time. See the way that our lives are changed are not by giving people a list of do's and don'ts, not by walking them through a simple prayer, but by giving them a real encounter with Jesus. And I wonder if we're going to have a revival, that it's not going to happen from a stage, but it's going to happen around a table. It's not going to happen in a sermon. It's going to happen through some conversations in your living room. I wonder if what Jesus is saying is, yes, I want you to tell people about me, but I actually want you to love people like I loved people. The outcast, the tax collector, the broken, the people who've been cast aside by other people. Jesus tells his own followers, don't throw a party for people that you know are going to invite you over. He said, go out and invite the people you know who can't repay you. That's what heaven on earth looks like. That's what we've been called to do. That's what true hospitality looks like. But I do want to give you just 3 things here. Like we've talked about it in theory, right? I think as pastors, we love theory. I love theology books. I love reading books by old dead people. That's great. But listen, all that theory and theology doesn't make a difference if we don't live it out. It's not what you know, it's what you live. So what does this look like for us to be a hospitable people? The first thing is this. I think we have to open our homes. I know it just seems like so basic, right? Like teaching is not giving you something new. It's just reminding you of stuff you already know. We got to open up our homes to people. But like that's where conversation happens. Like I love hanging out and being in the lobby here and everything else. But man, when you sit in somebody's dining room and you share a meal together, conversation happens. In fact, before we bought our last house, my wife really wanted a farmhouse table. You guys know farmhouse tables? Yeah, those things are expensive, right? And I guess, I'm a pastor. We were not buying no farmhouse table. But my dad always told me in life, there's two kinds of people. There's the kinds of people who can pay someone to do something, or you got to be the kind of person who does it yourself. So we're those kinds of people. And so I'm like, I could build a table. How hard could it be? I found a plan online. I went out and bought the wood. And nowadays, I don't even think I could afford the wood, to be honest with you. I mean, but we ended up building this table, and it sits in our dining room. And here's the thing about the table. It's not like this great work of art. Like you can see there's a bunch of cracks running through the side. In fact, a few years later, I Googled the plan to like see how I could fix it. And everyone's like, don't ever build this table. The way it's framed up, it's going to split. And so it's not like the most beautiful thing. It's not like there's dips and divots and everything else. But the thing I love about this table is that has been an altar in our house. It's been a place where we've had meals and conversations. We've celebrated with people. And we've had our friends who live around the world doing missions work come back home, and we throw a big party. We've sat around that table and had difficult conversations. We've celebrated with family. We've grieved with people. We've been through the ups and downs of life. That's where revival happens. At the table. I think it's lost on us sometimes that communion for first Christians was not crackers and juice. It was a meal around a table. People would sit together. They would share life together. And see, here's the thing, though. Real hospitality isn't just sitting down with your family and friends at that table. It's inviting the neighbors that you don't know, or the annoying person at work, or that person who posts all the dang stupid political stuff on Facebook. That's what real hospitality looks like. When we open our homes and we ask people to come in, the stranger, the person who looks, acts, thinks, believes differently than us. That's hospitality when we open our homes. The second thing, we need to open our hands. We talked about this last week about being able to give stuff away. And that's so true, but man, the more that I realize, I think some of us, we would love to be hospitable people, but your hands are so tightly wound around your calendar that there's no space for you to be hospitable. My wife and I sit down every week and we kind of go over our calendars, like, what do you got going on this week and what do I have going on? And I wonder if maybe, like for me and for some of us, we need to sit down with God and say, God, what do you have on the calendar for me this week? Or what's on this calendar that I need to take off so that I can make space for other people? Could we just be open-handed with that? And the last thing, just be to open our eyes. Open our eyes to see people the way Jesus sees them. We live in a culture and in a world where, man, people will tell us how to see the people who are different from us. That they're the enemy, that they're stupid, they're ignorant, that they hate you. Like, we get a lot of messages about people who are different than us. But when Jesus sees people who are different, he sees someone who's made in the image of God. He sees someone that he died for. He sees someone that he came for. I just keep going back to this. I think that when the church starts to be a place where we really love the stranger, that is the best apologetic to the world. That's the best sermon we could ever preach. That's the best evangelism that can ever happen, because we live in a world that is broken and divided, but to see a place that looks like heaven on earth, that is unified despite, by the way, unity is not uniformity. The goal is not to invite people into your home to convince them that you are right about things. The goal is simply to love them, because when you love them, they encounter Jesus, and Jesus changes everything. And so we're going to continue in just a moment with just a time of communion and reflection. As we do, we just want to give some space here this morning for you to wrestle with a couple of questions. Because again, we can talk about it in theory, but what does this actually look like and mean? The first question is this: who is a tax collector to me? Like, don't say like for somebody else or for my spouse, like who is the tax collector for you? It might be like a specific person's name comes to mind, or maybe for you it's people on that end of the political spectrum or the other, people who are living this life or the other. Who is that person? And then let's make it really practical. How can I love the stranger this week? Like, if you get the name of a person, how can you love that person this week? How can you reach out to the people around you? What would it look like for you? Not just to think about. That's what I love about what Michael said this morning. I told you his sermon was so good. We can talk a lot and think a lot, but until you start to do, listen, we are just the sum of a lot of small habits that we do consistently over the years. And we can say, I would love to be hospitable, but it doesn't start until you take the first step. What does that look like this week? And I know that if we do that, we are going to become more like Jesus. I think we could see a move of God like we never have before. So all across this room, would you just bow your heads and close your eyes with me? Jesus, we thank you that when we were the stranger, that you loved us. I'm thankful you came for the outcasts and the rejects, the tax collectors and the prostitutes. And God, I'm praying right now that you would open my heart. That if there are people that I'm viewing as a tax collector, that you would convict me of that. That you would help me repent of that. That you would give me the boldness to welcome them in with open arms. Not with an agenda or trying to control things, but simply to be your hands and feet. And so I pray right now that your Spirit would move in this room. That as we wrestle with these questions, that you would use this as a moment where we would encounter you in a radical way. And that we would leave here looking more like you than ever before. It's in your name I pray. Amen. As you feel led, you can have communion.